So there's 5 key areas that I would highlight. The first is really around an ability to ingest data from a lot of different sources. That can be via integrations from a different system, or it can be actually extracting that data from Excel files or PDFs. The second is a way to validate data as you ingest it, but then also store that information. So on the front end, you want to have validation rules that allow you to ensure high data quality, but then you need the flexibility in the data model to store different types of data. It can be whether that's infrastructure, real estate, et cetera. Those each have different operating data sets that you want to capture, but then a data model that can evolve with you as you grow, whether you're expanding into new asset classes, new products, new regions, et cetera. Third, I would say the ability to put a workflow around a process to ensure the right control and auditability. Valuation oversight's a really good example of that, where, as we know, historically, it's largely been driven out of Excel and email, but the regulators are really pushing organizations to drive more transparency and oversight on that process. 3 is the ability to do analysis. That can be things like running scenarios at an investment level, at a deal level, but then also looking across the portfolio, doing things like what happens if interest rates go up by a certain amount. And then finally, I would highlight a way to drive outcomes. And that can be things like regular reporting. It can be dashboards. It can be allowing a user to come in and query that data when they get, when something evolves in the market or they get a question, or it can also be sending that information via integration to another system rather than forcing people to extract it in Excel and try to manipulate it there.
I think what we're seeing across the market is there are 3 trends, and you could nearly characterize them as being quite foundational and fundamental. And that is the first being, what is my data source? How am I actually accessing this data? It's often coming in very different forms, sometimes PDFs, sometimes flat files, etc. So the actually ability to identify the source and really understand how you're actually accessing that data consistently and repeatably. That then leads to the second, which is, well, now that we've actually found it and we've sourced it, what are we actually doing with that? There's often a lot of wrangling going on through spreadsheets and, bespoke processing. And so how do I get some consistency and scalability in my processes and, the control and ownership and management of that data? And then the third, actually, even though we're talking about data and technology, is all about people. And the actual culture is often, you're hiring people that are strong on originating transactions, they're managing infrastructure or real estate or private equity assets. What about the skills required to actually manage, organize, report, and do analysis on data is something that companies are really grappling with at the moment. So if I start from the top down, and I'm specifically talking about superannuation funds here, if we start with what I would regard as structural constraints and challenges, and that could be that they've got different member options that they're looking to manage on behalf of their members. It could be that there's APRA regulations mean that there's certain performance tests they've got to deliver on. It could be that they have other objectives that are even conflicting with that, like a peer relative objective or a CPI plus. So there's some structural challenges that superannuation funds have to face into when managing at a whole of portfolio level. The next is a people challenge. And so all of a sudden you have a SAA allocation manager has a certain objective versus you're asking someone that's in equities to have quite a different objective, or someone in private markets. How do you get alignment of KPIs, of remuneration, and making sure everyone's pulling in the same direction and meeting those top level objectives that I was just talking about? And then finally, I describe it as the mechanics. That's where we start talking about data, technology. And so we've got private market data and quite unstructured at times, public market data quite structured. How do you bring that together in tools and solutions that enable that whole of portfolio level? You've got things, like risk, exposure, overall sort of rebalancing across the whole portfolio, scenario analysis. All of these things, can be challenges for firms at that whole of portfolio level.
So I'm actually going to talk about a couple of personas as examples of that. So if you take a deal manager, someone that's looking at real estate, private real estate as an example, their process to drive that investment and make a decision is very different than our portfolio manager on the public side. And so what we've really done is work to give them the ability to drive that unique process. But then there's a point where that data has to interact with the broader whole of portfolio to allow for pre-trade compliance as an example. So to give them the ability to drive their process, ensure that they can make the investment, and then once they've made the investment, then sending that to the back office to book that security. Giving them one place to do that versus causing them to have to go into multiple different systems, enter data multiple times is an example. Another would be portfolio manager. When they are looking at their whole portfolio, they don't care if it's public or private. They want to have the holistic view, but then the flexibility to start at a fund and drill all the way down to whatever level of granularity is within that fund and see different types of data sets for whether it's power prices or it's occupancy rate, or maybe it's a burn rate for fintech. And then finally, I would say risk. So risk at the portfolio level, when things like COVID happen, they want to be able to look at what is my exposure to transportation, to hotels. Again, it doesn't matter if it's public or private, and to be able to quickly get to that, know if they have to take action or not. But then also if you drill into an asset class specific example, something like private credit, where they want the ability to look across their whole book of loans and see how am I tracking, how are my covenants doing? What are the borrowers that are potentially going to breach, I think, or are trending in that direction, so that one, I can forecast what I think my default rates are going to be, but then maybe I can even recommend going and proactively engaging with a borrower to potentially renegotiate terms to avoid that.